Welcome back. It's super exciting to see everyone. Welcome to week 9, which means that we're, 3/4 of the way through? That is actually crazy. But the dark, pitch black outside reminds us that that is true. Thank you all for all of your patience in working through this text and trying to dig out of it sort of all the lessons that we can find for the present. Now, as usual, of course, I was going to sort of say something about the fact that we were having this really interesting conversation about crime right before the stream started, and about the way that crime is a driver of capitalist technology. So every time you shoplift, every time you engage in petty crime, know that you're doing the sort of fine work of civilization and developing new forms of technology, not for capitalism, but for us. So we're here not on that subject, talking about 2 chapters from the Black Jacobins this week. But first, as usual, we are going to recap a little bit of what we talked about last week, particularly for those who weren't there, those on the stream who are just catching up. Last week, we were really centered on the question of the fall of Robespierre and what that meant transnationally. We talked about the ways in which James is very careful to kind of parse out the meaning of the reign of terror under the Jacobins, and to insist against the sort of bourgeois historians of the 20th century who had sought to recast the terror of the French Revolution as being a purely negative thing and something that foreshadowed what they saw as the excesses of Stalinism in the Soviet Union. Against that, or preemptively I should say against that, James emphasizes, and this is here being true to his own sort of Trotskyism, right? Here is someone who's very critical of Stalinism, but also not to the degree of being a liberal or denouncing all use of violence and force in the name of revolution. It was Trotsky, himself who crushed the revolt at Kronstadt. It was Trotsky himself who militarized labor in the Soviet Union. And so, as a Trotskyist, James is trying to thread, this needle. And he does so by insisting first and foremost that the terror saved France. The terror saved the revolution, it saved France, but that, the terror that saved France was the first in 2 phases of the terror, right? He distinguishes very sharply before the 2, the first of which targeted the aristocracy, targeted the enemies of the revolution, and the second of which, after Robespierre in James's account, hits the limits of the bourgeois revolution, right? He stretches the elasticity of what a sort of bourgeois leader can do without fully abandoning his status as bourgeois. And when he hits that limit, according to James, the terror then turns inward. It turns on the workers, on the masses, on the poor, who were, of course, the base of his support, right? And so according to James, the fundamental lesson of this piece of the revolution, of the downfall of Robespierre, is that when he turned the violence of the state against the poor, he was destroying his own left and destroying his own base. So that when the counter-revolution came, there was no one there to protect him, and he lost his head. Now for James, despite that elasticity, there's a limit, right? And what's very interesting is that he positions Toussaint as someone who can go beyond Robespierre in this instance. He can move beyond Robespierre specifically, though, on the question of slavery and abolition. There are material reasons, in other words, for the fact that Toussaint is able to go further. As a former slave, as someone related to slaves, descended from slaves, someone with the experience of slavery, he could fight slavery without limit. That's the way James puts it. He and others were dedicated 100%, and I want to be very careful with this because Toussaint will have a limit, right? It just happens that this is not the limit. Right? The question of slavery. He can be 100% dedicated to the abolition of slavery. And more than that, as James emphasizes, he and other former slaves were not simply fighting slavery, but they were in fact, in his understanding, doing the universal work of human history, right? They were destroying feudalism. They were transforming, the history of the globe, and they were moving human history forward in a kind of dialectical way. In other words, they weren't narrowly focused on the question of slavery, or they were, in a sense, but in so doing, were contributing to a far broader process. And he always wants to emphasize that piece. Finally, we talked a little bit about, because we were sort of dealing with this question, this sort of conundrum that James is confronting about why it was that Toussaint effectively expelled Sonthonax, one of the most beloved of the French leaders, the one closest to the black population, the one most supportive of abolition. And as he's trying to disentangle it, this allowed us to talk a little bit about Babeuf's conspiracy of equals in France, and about how that played a role in a specific moment characterized by a kind of dynamic interplay of coups and counter coups, leading the French Revolution to a sort of new bourgeois stabilization, right? It was a bit confusing, but if people remember, there was a very royalist takeover of the Directory. There were sort of like attempts, at a coup. There was a resistance to that, the expulsion of some of the more far-right elements, and the restabilization of a kind of centrist bourgeois Directory. And it's in the context of that not only the conspiracy of equals, this sort of radical communist, arguably one of the first, truly communist movements in Europe and in France in particular, fails, and at the same time contributes to a dynamic in which Toussaint, under threat, has to expel Sonthonax in order to stabilize and win some good, some sort of favor from the French, the French government, right? This was a moment of reaction, in other words. The Thermidorian reaction had reached a new stage, and as we will see today, there's still further for it to go. Now, today we're turning to a pivotal pair of chapters that, on the surface at least, are rich with historical detail and intrigue, documenting the expulsion of the British from the island, the defeat of the mulatto state in the south, and the defeat and seizure of Spanish Santo Domingo, namely what we know as DR. But we need to be clear that in all of these cases, we're not looking just simply at historical detail, but instead we're charting a sequence whereby Toussaint effectively overcame one by one the three remaining barriers to his total rise to power over the whole island of Hispaniola. In other words, moving from what had been the rise of Toussaint to his seizure of power, which are very different things. Right? Recall that as we begin these chapters, Toussaint is the hinge. James had described him as a hinge, as the connection between the different forces on the island, the person on whom everything depends. And this is in part because he's at this point occupying a middle ground between the French on the one hand and the mulatto forces under Rigaud, with whom he is now closely allied, and who himself was delighted at the expulsion of Sonthonax. They had been sort of at each other's throats with mutual recrimination and attempts on the other. So Rigaud is incredibly happy to see Sonthonax leave, despite the role that he had played when it came to the black workers. Toussaint, from this position then of unquestioned authority and military power, is now preparing to sweep the British out of the colony entirely. The British had lost by this point something like 100,000 troops to this ill-fated invasion, and they couldn't win. They were kind of doomed from the very beginning, in large part because they were hamstrung by the same kind of dynamic that often leads to the hamstringing. Is that the term? The hamstringing of many racial regimes, which is the fact that they had offered some limited freedom to mixed race mulattoes, but they could not offer freedom and equality to the black workers, because in James's words, that would have been selling the horse to preserve the stable. They weren't fighting to liberate a free black population. They were fighting to reproduce and benefit and profit from the forced labor of that system, right? There was no interest for them to take the colony if they weren't going to maintain some level of forced labor. This is the same, if it needs to be said, this is part of the same dynamic that dooms the Confederacy in the US, right? It can't free the black population as soldiers because they would immediately pick up those arms and fight against their own slave masters, right? Meanwhile, Sonthonax's replacement arrives from France, a man named Houdoville. Every time I try to speak French, it sounds like I'm making fun of French people, but I assure you, I was raised in Maine. We were taught to make fun of French people, but I reject that because I love my French brothers and sisters. Anyway, his name is Houdoville. The Directory leading France in the aftermath of the counter coup of 18th Fructidor. Again, remember, these weird names come from the French Revolutionary Calendar, which renamed and restructured the entirety of time as a measure of the tabula rasa, sort of transformation of French society. The Directory is concerned at Sonthonax's return to France, but they are in some ways more concerned, more alarmed at the sort of counter-accusations between Sonthonax and Toussaint about the other, plotting for independence. And they were far more worried, this is what matters, they were far more worried about Toussaint than they were worried about the mulattoes. And so the French began to soften what had been an antagonistic position toward Rigaud, and even considered either, they went back and forth between considering arresting the leader of the mulatto forces or then using him against Toussaint. By the time he arrived, Oudonville had been well briefed on Toussaint's power, with his advisors telling him that Toussaint, in his words, quote, has on his own an ascendancy which nothing can counterbalance. With him you can do all, without him you can do nothing. Right? This is the message that Oudonville had received. So he was aware of the power that Toussaint had, and meanwhile, in James's description, Toussaint trusted none of them. So Toussaint is negotiating with Maitland, the British commander, while preparing his final assault on the British, eventually winning, as James describes it, 7 victories in 7 days. But in classic Toussaint fashion, he does so with the utmost respect for the laws of war. He forbids looting, he forbids pillage, and he even offers an incredibly generous and what would be very controversial amnesty to the treasonous residents of the British-controlled areas. These were mostly white planters who had not only been occupied by the British, but actively fought alongside the British and embraced the British forces. In James's words, this again confirmed that Toussaint was, what he calls a man who all his life seemed quite untouched by the ordinary passion of revenge, and never let anything divert him from his aim, the restoration of San Domingo and the reconciliation of all the inhabitants, white, brown, and black. And here reconciliation is really going to be the key term. While the white emigres on their return enacted revenge, Toussaint's Africans, this is what James calls them, it's a very interesting term. He refers to them as Toussaint's Africans. He says Toussaint's Africans did not, and he marched into Port-au-Prince to a hero's welcome. But Maitland, as he's leaving, this is the British commander, he's already trying to divide Toussaint from Rigaud. But the latter, Rigaud in this case, resisted. On their way, jointly, they were sort of like traveling together to meet the French commander, Oudonville. These two adversaries turned allies met for the first time in person, and reportedly, this is a sort of report that James passes along, but he knows it's not confirmable in any kind of way, reportedly agreed to jointly resist any intrigues by the French, right? To stay united in the face of what they expected from the French in the name of unity. But once in the presence of the French representatives, the French leader, Oudonville, immediately started flattering Rigaud and sought to divide the two against one another. Again, this is a leader that had been warned about how important Toussaint was. I'm going to keep repeating that because he knew what he was doing, and yet he kept doing it. In the meeting together, he flattered Rigaud, he sought to divide the two. So now you've got both the British and the French administrations trying to divide these two forces. In this case, in particular, if he didn't take the bait when it came to the British, it seems as if Rigaud took the bait when it came to the French, right? In the process, as James puts it, he ruined himself, his caste, and his country for a generation. Since the beginning of the revolution, the mulattoes had, again in James's words, he repeats this sort of phrasing, they had wavered continuously between the black workers on the one hand and the French bourgeoisie on the other. But James is clear as to where the cause of this instability comes from. He writes on page, I believe it's page 207, mulatto instability lies not in their blood, but in their intermediate position in society, right? They're an intermediary class. They're not a race by any sort of, means. They are a class defined by privilege and position and property and rights, and it's on this basis that their instability lay. An instability that's parallel to the instability of the French bourgeoisie. Right? Again, Rigaud fell for it. He fell for the divide and rule kind of tactics, not realizing that the French were simply using him, and with what consequences we shall soon see. So, despite Eudoville's maneuvering, despite his backdoor negotiations with the British, and indeed his, quote, thoughtlessly prodding at the man on whose army and influence everything depended, Toussaint single-handedly convinced the British to leave the island entirely, but James is clear that this wasn't simply because the British or their commander Maitland respected the black workers or respected Toussaint on a personal level. He writes, Maitland, a prejudiced Englishman, did not think that Toussaint was very intelligent. But he did understand something that the French commander didn't understand, which was that the army that Toussaint had built was indeed powerful and the determining force. And what's interesting here is the way that Maitland and Eudoville share this kind of, what I call a colonial blind spot, this inability to grasp their antagonist, this systematic sort of underestimation of the power of Toussaint and of the power of the sort of black army, in part because, or not in part, fundamentally because they were so racist that they couldn't see what was right in front of their eyes. On the way out the door, Maitland himself even went so far as wanting to strengthen Toussaint against the French. He proposed making him king of the island. He said, listen, we will provide the ships, you declare independence, and we will protect you. Right? This seems like a tempting proposal, and we've seen Toussaint, this is going to be very important in this chapter, we've seen Toussaint be willing to side with the British when it helps advance black rights, right? When it helps advance the cause of abolition. James is clear. He says, despite the fact that Toussaint could have agreed, he had the army, he had the authority over that army, he had the authority over the black masses, right? He could have agreed and made this a reality. But despite that, in James's words on 212, his refusal to accept this proposal is the measure of the difference between himself and Rigaud. The measure of the difference between himself and Rigaud. And now this is a statement both about principle on the one hand, but also about political intelligence. He knew that the British would just break this alliance as soon as it was necessary, and he knew that they would restore slavery. This is something that Maitland at the time is confirming in letters that he's writing to others. James has a very interesting conclusion to this conversation where he's reproducing these bits of Maitland's letter where he's being super clear about how they have every intention of exploiting this labor to the maximum, right? They have every intention of restoring slavery. And toward the bottom of page 212, there's a lot of this in these chapters. James writes, it was in the best tradition of the way in which the higher civilization uplifts the backward peoples, right? The sarcasm is thick, right? He's talking about the so-called civilized being the most barbaric, being the most duplicitous, and being the most dishonest. This is something he'll say over and over again in these chapters, and it sort of echoes people like Aimé Césaire, whose entire goal is to say the colonizer is a decivilizing force, right? They claim to be the most civilized, and they act as the opposite. Such is history, James writes, but if that were all, it would be unreadable. How do we identify the threads that draw it together? There's a lot of noise outside. I don't have any idea what it is, but. So, unlike Rigaud, I'm going to keep going. Unlike Rigaud, Toussaint had strategic intelligence and principles. And for the first time, James tips his analytic hand as to what will ultimately I'm going to repeat that. For the first time, CLR James really begins to tip his analytic hand as to what will become Toussaint's tragic flaw, right? So on the one hand, he's complimenting Toussaint. He's saying, unlike Rigaud, he has this political principle, and he pairs it with a kind of strategic analysis that is, very sort of far-sighted and powerful. But immediately that compliment becomes something of an Achilles heel, right? And again, this will become, Toussaint's tragic flaw in the way that the text concludes. As James writes, Toussaint was then, as always, devoted to the French Republic. This devotion will in the end lead him to an untimely and cruel death. So he's loyal to France, and this loyalty will lead him to an untimely and cruel death. But he writes immediately, this is toward the top of 213 for those who are following along. But it gave him a splendid life. To all the blacks, revolutionary France, which had decreed equality and the abolition of slavery, was a beacon among the nations. France was to them indeed the mother country. Toussaint, looking always to the development of the blacks as a people, did not want to break with France, its language and traditions and customs, to join the slaveholding British. He would be faithful to France as long as France was faithful to the blacks. Right? This was not a sort of absolute faith, but it was very much tied to an understanding of the role that France had played and was capable of playing. Again, recall that Toussaint had fought with the British, but he fought with the British in a context in which neither side was for abolition. Once you understand that that's his fundamental motivation and the anchor of his politics, you realize why he could maneuver freely at a certain point, meaning before 1794, but after that, there was no way he would be moving back toward an alliance with the British, unless the French, of course, completely betrayed abolition, right? In the end, the West Indies would be a total defeat for the British Empire. But while they blamed intrigue, incompetence, climate, and fever, as James writes, it was the decree of abolition, the bravery of the blacks, and the ability of their leaders that had done it. He said there was fever everywhere in the Caribbean. Why did they lose here? And they lost because abolition created an army. That army developed out of skilled leadership, and these forces were what effectively defeated the British and cost them 100,000 lives. And he continues, the great gesture of the French working people toward the black slaves against their own white ruling class had helped to save their revolution from reactionary Europe. The French workers, acting in solidarity with the black slaves against their own ruling class, had helped to save the revolution from reactionary Europe. The revolution on both sides of the ocean, right? That is what had saved the French Revolution, that is what continuously saved it, and that is what allowed for and drove forward the revolution in Haiti as well. Again, this is the universal task and the universal role that James is granting to these formerly enslaved black people. Right? Not only were they doing something so unprecedented as carrying out a successful slave revolution, that sounds like the highest sort of praise and the highest level of historic recognition, but James is saying that we need to recognize that there's a higher contribution still, which is that the impact of this revolution was not limited to the island, right? It was not limited to Haiti. It was something that James identifies as universal in his understanding. So they drove out the British, but as James writes, there is no gratitude in politics, and so the French and Udonville wanted Toussaint gone, even though he had been the one that did it, right? This is a repeat of a previous story where he had defeated the British the first time, and they still attacked him. They still undermined his power. James mentions the way that Udonville even hurled racist insults like him, describing him as the old monkey with the handkerchief. But true to form, despite all of this, Toussaint was trying to reconcile with the emigre whites. He was inviting back all of those emigres who would swear loyalty to him and to the Republic. One of the questions that this raises is why? Why so much effort? This is a question that we'll return to. Why so much effort to disarm these emigres? It could be strategic because, on the one hand, they had been conspiring abroad, and so bring them back, give them a little bit of material wealth, give them access to their lands and to their profits, and then they will stop their conspiring. We've already previously, though, raised the question of his own understanding of the degree to which he thought he needed the landowners because of the sort of knowledge of cultivation or their ability to manage a plantation structure was involved, and the problematic, elements that raises, right? Do we want plantations at all, right? And James also talks about it was a way and a move to reincorporate the black troops that had been fighting with these white emigres under the British back into his own army. So there's a lot of strategic calculations that he is talking about. And it's in this context that the French governor, Udonville, begins to attack Toussaint repeatedly, right? Again, not learning the lesson, not understanding the warning that Toussaint was the one person on which everything depended. Of course, threatened by that very fact, right? Threatened by the autonomy, the power that he's developing, the fact that at any point, this great black general could declare independence, although he had no plan to at this point. Udonville is accusing him of conspiring with the enemies of France, namely with these white emigres who had fought for the British. He even accused him of overstepping the bounds of separation of kind of church and state, because the French Revolution was a very secular revolution, and Toussaint was a very devout Catholic. And in the context of all these attacks from Udonville, Toussaint resigns as commander-in-chief. He just says, listen, I'm going to tender my resignation. And James, if you're interested in it, it's a super interesting letter. James quotes his resignation letter at length. This is over on page 217. He claims that it was out of despair, that he didn't want to become one of those leaders who, by virtue of doing the good work he needed to do, was making enemies all over the place. He claimed that he wanted to retreat into the privacy of his own family life. This doesn't sound much like, like Toussaint as we've seen him up to this point. But James says that it was sincere. And he said that, first and foremost, that Udonville could have dismissed him at any point. He could have just fired him, right? And so on that level, the resignation wasn't the most sort of meaningful gesture, but that it would have provoked, a civil war. And James says the letter was not a bluff, the resignation was not a bluff, but in the end, it was the San Domingo masses that saved him, right? This is becoming a repeating theme. It is always the masses that save the leaders. And in this case, the San Domingo masses saved Toussaint, who was attempting to resign, right? You submit a resignation, it has to be accepted. In the context of him having submitted this resignation, there's a wave of unrest against the policies that Udonville is instituting across San Domingo. He tried to introduce, in particular, James mentions apprenticeship, which James calls a stupidity. He says this is a stupidity that the British would later repeat. It is a stupidity that the Americans would then repeat in the aftermath of abolition in this country. What apprenticeship means is that you are free, but your children are forcibly required to then apprentice with the planter, right? In many cases, at least I don't know about this context, in the US context, it was literally the former owner, right? Your children had to be, put into the hands of this former owner for a period of a certain number of years as a so-called apprenticeship, right? So this is the kind of policy that Udonville is trying to institute. There, as everywhere, it's a policy for the prolongation of slavery, right? Not for its abolition. It's an attempt to maintain the structure of slavery and to be a middle step between slavery and freedom. And James is very clear, this will also become consequential. He says the Haitian masses might have accepted that from Toussaint, they might have accepted it from Laveau or from Sonthonax, but they were not going to accept it from Udonville, who had not gained and did not deserve any of the sympathy that these other leaders had earned. And quite the opposite. He, in the words of James, made it very clear that he sought to once more put black men where they belong. and this was clear. But the effect of the unrest against these policies proved to him, reminded him something that he should have already known, which was namely the fact that he actually needed Toussaint, that he wouldn't survive in power without Toussaint, that Toussaint was the only one who could talk to the black workers, who could calm any insurrectionary tendencies. And so he began to desperately backtrack from the confrontation that he was provoking. But he didn't backtrack quickly enough. The final straw came when he then clashed with Bois, who is Toussaint's very revolutionary nephew. It's a name that we'll come back to next week. And someone who was very close to the black working class, very close to the mass of workers, who had his finger kind of on the pulse of those workers. And so, in this clash, as it unfolds, Autonville first fires Bois and then attempts to have him arrested. And James says, listen, technically, as the governor, that was within his rights, but it was an incredibly stupid thing to do because of the mass sympathy and support that Bois enjoyed. As James described it, a level of support second only to Toussaint himself. Right? So imagine then, the French trying to clash with this sort of second most popular leader. And this brings the country to the very verge of insurrection, as one might expect. And so Toussaint finally responds by ordering Dessalines, his lieutenant, to arrest the French governor, W.E.B. Right? This is a massive step. He's ordering the arrest of the highest French official in the land. James writes, Toussaint had given the agent ample rope, and Autonville had hanged himself. As soon as he felt the rope tightening, he tried to backtrack as quickly as possible again, but it was far too late. As Dessalines approached the capital to seize him and to arrest him, Autonville boarded a ship with 1,000, as James puts it, 1,000 white, free black, and mulatto functionaries, and they flee the country. The Rubicon had been crossed, as James writes. We keep crossing Rubicons, but this is certainly a very, very serious one, right? The Rubicon had been crossed, and Toussaint did not back down. He gave an incredibly powerful public speech where he not only denounced Autonville, but he also reinstated Bois and writes, this is on page 220. He says a number of very interesting things. I reinstate Bois in his former functions. Who reverts to the sword will perish by the sword. Autonville says that I'm against liberty, that I want to surrender to the English, that I wish to make myself independent. Who ought to love liberty more? Toussaint Louverture, slave of Breda, or General Autonville, former Marquis and Chevalier de Saint Louis? If I wish to surrender to the English, why would I have chased them away? Remember that there is only one Toussaint Louverture in San Domingo, and that at his name everybody must tremble. This was the new Toussaint, James writes. And I want to just emphasize the fact that he says, listen, this gets to the question of concrete freedom. He says, who should love freedom more? I'm being accused of not loving freedom, but who would love it more? This aristocratic general or someone who was formerly enslaved and has fought for and won that freedom, right? That's an incredibly important statement on the necessity for a more concrete understanding of freedom. Who reverts to the sword will perish by the sword. And when he says, this is the new Toussaint, this was the new Toussaint, we're right back at the question of the role of the individual in relation to historical dynamics, right? Because when he says this is the new Toussaint, he's flagging the fact that we're talking about the individual that this process has created, right? This is the new Toussaint that has been created by what he calls the locomotive of revolution. The incredibly fast locomotive of revolution that makes and unmakes things overnight, that creates dynamics that are irreversible, that creates moments and breaks and ruptures in which, as James puts it, there's no going back. This is the man that the locomotive had made, the steel sharpened by steel. Henceforth, he would govern. In other words, govern on his own, govern as an independent leader. Not formally independent yet. He didn't want war with France. He insisted, but he said he would defend himself. And then James writes in a very interesting way. This is toward the end of this first chapter on the expulsion of the British. He says, where was he heading for? He did not know. His powerful mind, unaided by precedent or education, was slowly working it out. The break had come, the Rubicon had been crossed, although this wasn't a planned process. The question then is to develop an understanding of where things move next. It's 1799. Eudonville is gone, he fled. Technically, Roum, the French governor, is Roum, who inherits his authority. Eudonville is back in France. He's pessimistic about the ability of France to retain the colony. And the only option he suggests to possibly do that, this is in the middle of page 222. I'll take some questions in a second after this. But the only possibility that Eudonville mentions for retaining the colony is, in his words, to create germs of division between them, to embitter the hate which exists between the mulattoes and the blacks, and to oppose Rigaud to Toussaint. That's the strategy, right? He sought deliberately to create and sharpen race hatred. His last act was to send a letter to Rigaud, the mulatto general, saying, you no longer have to answer to Toussaint. He knew he was leaving, but the gesture of that, the function of that, was to create a sense of independence and a sense of flattery that then would deepen the contradiction between the two class forces. Again, when James is talking about the decivilizing impact of ostensibly civilizing forces like the colonizers, he's very clear. This is on page 223, right in the middle. Eudonville and his superiors belonged to the same breed as Maitland and his. Uninhibited, they wallowed with zest in the filth and mire of their political conceptions and needs among the very leaders of their society, but nevertheless the very dregs of human civilization and moral standards. He says, a historian who finds excuses for such conduct, specifically by references to the supposed spirit of the times. In other words, this happened so long ago. Of course, people were behaving in these kind of immoral ways. We hear this very often. That kind of historian, James writes, shows thereby that his account of events is not to be trusted. Eudonville, after all, was a product of the great French Revolution. He had no excuse for his immorality. He had no excuse for his kind of double dealing, right? The idea that someone operating in the past is somehow above certain moral claims simply doesn't take into account the context of what that past looked like, right? Ultimately, as James puts it at the very end of the chapter, they had their reasons, so have their counterparts of today. They fill our newspapers and our radios. The type is always with us, and so are their defenders. Cool. Let's take some questions before we move on to chapter 10. What do folks have?
Ahead of time for my pronunciation of the French names, but
I mean, I've been absolutely butchering the French language. So
it sounded great. I know it's going to be bad. So I feel like a lot of James's tone is coming through in this chapter with kind of how we read Eudonville, but I feel like I'm just kind of curious to see what your take of Toussaint's perspective of him is, because one of my favorite lines was from the letter he sent in his resignation, where he's like, that is why I addressed my resignation to you, and if I had not known them, you would have taught them to me by ceaselessly reminding me that you can dismiss me. And it just felt like there was a lot of sass coming through, and I kind of loved it.
Yeah. Hugely sassy. But it's funny, I'm not sure Toussaint has ever been described in exactly that term, but but here we are. And it's true, right? And you can see in his letters, there's a great deal of respect, a great deal of formal respect for the authority of the French Revolution, right? But there's moments specifically during this process of his rise, his development of his own power, that you can tell that he is becoming more confident and more willing to speak out of turn, right? He does this increasingly in this chapter and into the next chapter. He doesn't trust the French, right? He doesn't trust the English, he doesn't trust the Spanish, he doesn't trust the white colonists. This is clear, but he has a certain level of respect for institutional power that is fought or that has served the sort of objective of abolition, right? But he's also someone who's seen, right? He's seen these sort of representatives come and go. And he's also been graced by what, at least in James's account, were administrators from France that truly felt and were connected to the cause of Black liberation. And so in this case, I think he's got a particular amount of sass, but it's also, again, all of these things, and even James' own writing is should be understood in the context of dynamic transformation of the author and the subject, right? James, Toussaint are in motion. In this, particular moment, Toussaint is in motion toward an independence of spirit and mind, at the very least, and independence of a people and a country sort of down the line. So yeah, he's crossing the line for sure. And he's saying, listen, but also he's saying, you could have fired me. Why can't you fire me, right? Because your formal power is not the same as the power that I have amassed and built, right? So he's also reminding, the French that they don't truly have the power. What else?
Okay. So we have a question from the chat that says, I remember at the start of this that you mentioned that James wrote this in part to inspire and inform anti-colonial movement in Africa. We are well into the book and the weeds of how and why. So how does the way James writes about the revolution in Haiti connect to his desire to inform and inspire folks in Africa at the time?
Yeah. How does this connect to what he himself understood to be the goal, right? Which is to show the possibility of revolution, right? So first and foremost, we need to remember that James is not writing in the context of the African Revolution, right? In the context of decolonization across the continent. He's writing decades before, right? He can see that it's coming. He can see that it's coming because he is sort of living in London, traveling back and forth to Paris. He is in touch with an entire young generation of what will become the post-independence African leaders, right? He knows that the ferment is there. He knows the way that they're thinking, and he knows, more specifically, that the struggle against colonialism and the sort of protest movements and strikes and other sort of spontaneous level rebellions are developing. He can see all that coming, but he's not writing in the context of the revolution. So what he's trying to show is, first and foremost, possibility, right? Revolution is possible, self-government is possible. Below all colonization is one fundamental, I was going to say assumption, but it's more of just a sort of an assertion, which is to say that these people cannot govern themselves, right? They're not capable, but also they don't want to, right? They actually need and want and deeply desire to be colonized and led towards civilization. We may talk about Fanon next semester, we're not sure yet, but one of Fanon's main or sort of primary sort of counterpoints was a kind of psychology that had developed that argued that colonized people suffered a very specific kind of complex that made them want to be colonized, right? This was the projection of the colonial sort of rhetoric and language into the psyche of the colonized, the assumption that by virtue of certain manifestations of inferiority, it was assumed that colonized people by nature had that inferiority built into their psyches, right? Fanon comes along, he says, of course that's not true, right? What you're seeing as symptoms of inferiority is the product of decades, if not centuries, of inferiority being taught, right? Being inculcated, structures of power, right? So that is fundamentally, that's what Fanon is up against. Again, Fanon is writing a few decades later. In this context, James is trying to show possibility. And in a way, if we recall his, the way that he felt that Du Bois was more advanced than he was, it was in the way that Du Bois didn't necessarily try to prove possibility, but move beyond it, right? And there are many ways in which they're doing the same things, but that's definitely part of the piece. So what James is trying to show is that we don't need to, first of all, buy into certainly a kind of colonial logic that says African people can't govern themselves. Of course they can. They have risen up, and not only risen up in rebellion, but they've also organized armies, they've organized the revolution, and they've organized the state. And again, revolution is a very loaded concept that bears within it an understanding of the reordering of society according to a new kind of plan. It's not just a revolt, it's not just a rebellion, and so it's also important for him to show that it's a revolution, right? It's the reconstruction, it's the rebuilding of a society. So that's what James is trying to show when it comes to the sort of African revolution. And I'll say, sorry, just one tiny little thing, but as we get ready for the next one, Fanon writing decades later is consequential in the sense that in James, James knew this. There's this short little speech by James from the 70s actually, called From Du Bois to Fanon, that you can find on our Instagram. And what's very interesting about it is that part of the way he locates Fanon is to say, Fanon's writing in the context of the revolution, right? And so Fanon is very concerned with the limitations of national liberation, right? The limitations of national sovereignty, the dangers and the threats posed by this new leadership. James, in a certain sense, is concerned with this, but that's not why he didn't start to write the book to say, listen, the things that Toussaint and others are going to do after the revolution are not going to be enough. That's why we need to think sort of 3 steps ahead of ourselves. He's very much concerned with the primary question of how does the revolution start? How is it organized? How does it come to a successful kind of resolution? Yeah.
Okay. Jumping off of the previous question, is James insinuating that a revolution is required in the colonizer's country for a successful revolution in the colonized country in his references to the importance of the support given by the French working class to the Haitian black workers? Do you want me to repeat it?
Yeah, so is the question, is a revolution necessary in the colonized country?
Is a revolution required in the colonizer's country?
In the colonizer's country?
Yes.
Oh, okay, got it.
For a successful revolution in the colonized country.
Is a revolution necessary in France for the revolution in Haiti to be possible? That's a really interesting and loaded kind of question. I think I'd say a few things. One is, I don't think James would, he wouldn't, on the one hand, he's really just narrating history, right? He's trying to narrate it in its full kind of dynamic breadth and depth. And that's important to him. In other words, it's not necessarily a statement on possibility or impossibility, it's a statement on what happened, right? But to identify the forces involved in it happening required this transnational sort of framing. The second thing, though, is that I think he would probably be pretty insistent that these things are very often transnational, right? That many of the revolutions that we analyze as revolutions shouldn't and can't be understood as bounded by the nation state. And then finally, I would go maybe even a little further for James to say that in a certain sense, and this is where James differs maybe from other sort of black revolutionaries, in a certain sense, James is just as concerned with the revolution in France for the French masses as he is with the Haitian Revolution, right? That is just as important to him. In other words, these are people fighting for their freedom against a feudal system, and also against the bourgeoisie, also against the creeping capitalist system. They're fighting with the possibility of building something far more radical. We've seen how they're fighting for communism, even if it's emerging in a sort of half-formed way that is less concrete than what's being fought for in the Haitian context. So I would say that that's definitely a piece of it. As to whether or not you could think more about how the necessity of the two bind together and the limitations, right? Again, because I'm thinking about Fanon very clearly is like, listen, the revolution in Europe is being has entered a blind alley. The working class in Europe, for Fanon, is not a revolutionary force. Dialectics have turned into stasis in the European context. The struggle is not, going to be located there. James doesn't necessarily think the same in general, but also in this context, specifically in this context, right? Again, he sees the force being unleashed by the French masses as being an incredibly powerful one, and one that can go, a significant length. But also, he is someone who then, just a few decades later, is championing not only Black workers in the US context specifically, but also women, also students, also other members of the autonomous sort of working class in the US context. And that's at the very, very heart of, colonial capitalism. So on the spectrum of thinkers that, you could say, you describe as maybe like workerist thinkers who locate the revolution at the industrial core. And here I mentioned Tony Negri earlier, very much a workerist, right? The revolution is going to come at the center, of production in his earlier work, but even later, like in the sort of social milieu of Europe. And other workerists, similarly locate these kinds of dynamics. And on the other end, you have maybe third worldists, right? People that say, listen, the working class in the global core is too bought off. The revolution is going to come from the global periphery. And James is definitely somewhere in between, right? Whereas someone like Fanon is more, centered on national liberation struggles in the global periphery as being the driving force of a global revolution. You can see pieces of both, though, in the way that he frames things. What else?
Yeah, I feel like in these two chapters, it really became a prominent theme, like Toussaint's Catholicism and him being really devout, and you're starting to see more things happening in letters from leaders to each other being like, he's trustworthy, and you can judge his character based on him being Catholic. And it's just making me think of obviously, like, James and Toussaint both have like a little bit of Eurocentrism we've talked about, but I'm just like wondering how religion and like traditional practices are being spatially organized at this point. Like, where are the Maroons? Like, are the masses doing more of like voodoo and African traditional religions? Just how is it organized, and are most of the leaders Catholic? And just a bunch of questions there. But
no, these are great questions, and they're ones that are difficult to kind of, I think, get to, in part because James doesn't get us all the way there, right? You have to rely on a lot of the later, work that other, folks have offered on these questions. And there's definitely something troubling in the way that, again, like we already mentioned the phrase when James writes Toussaint's Africans, right? And he doesn't just mean African-descended people on the island. He means literally Africans, right? He means people born in Africa, and so he means people that are, less likely to speak French and are more likely to have very, very different belief structures, very, very different religions, right? And that's, an important kind of gap to sort of hold and bear in mind. As we know, things like voodoo and other kind of syncretic faiths draw upon African faiths and mix them and blend them together and bind them with, with European faiths, with elements of them. They sort of like create these entirely new structures and ways of thinking that incorporate elements of both, right? And it's sort of this contextual reconfiguration of Eurocentric faith, right? And the refilling of it with different sort of content from a different context. And that's incredibly powerful, right? Whether you put sort of Latin American sort of like faiths that emerge, whether it's like Santeria in the Caribbean and elsewhere, but you see a sort of dozens and dozens of different forms of this emerging all over, right? You see the ways that very conservative elements of evangelical faith are offered to enslaved people in the U.S. South and used or deployed with the goal of inculcating passivity and deference, but which are seized upon by Nat Turner and many others in an explicit way to say, no, but they also uphold our right to resist, and to resist in a very radical way, right? So you've got both of these things happening, right? You don't want to sort of downplay the possibility of that sort of syncretic transformation of faith, right? Or like the way that it gets refilled with different, more radical content. But you also don't want to sort of completely erase the potentially Eurocentric and conservative content that it also brings with it, right? Which is probably, definitely true for Toussaint, right? And this is like this question of like him being respected because of that, or him being kind of, respectable in a certain kind of light because of that is definitely troubling. And again, James doesn't get us there. Other folks who are more attentive to maroon communities, more attentive to the, not just voodoo as sparking the revolution, right, but as a guiding structural force, right? And in part because those are not questions that the post-revolutionary state can resolve, right, or does resolve. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
We have another question from the chat. Toussaint and the revolution were able to take advantage of warring superpowers. How would this apply now, as these Western superpowers are now aligned together, especially when looking at Palestine?
So the question is around how to sort of, or whether it's possible today to use superpowers in opposition to one another, right? Particularly around the question of Palestine to today. I mean, I think it's too simple to say that these Europeans, just because they're European, that these superpowers are aligned with each other. I think there are contradictions and tensions there. Obviously, we also live in a very multipolar world, and multipolarity is an accomplishment of a long history of movements, but it's also a context that part of what's so, important about a multipolar world. By that I mean the presence of China, the presence of other counterweights, the presence of what had previously been a kind of unified Latin America, all of these pieces as counterweights to the unquestioned global hegemony of the US, is that it creates these kind of gaps in space, right? So I'd say those definitely exist, right? On Palestine, there are significant gaps between the US and European countries even, but obviously also when it comes to China, Russia, and others. And so I think the question is less, is that possible? The question is, how do you make use of those fragmentations in a strategic way, right? How do you take advantage of a situation in a way that benefits liberation? And that is what the non-aligned movements did for many decades, right? The goal was not to simply align with, the Soviet Union or the US. The goal was to create this alternative space and to use and leverage, that space for and toward liberation. It's not easy, but part of what I think Toussaint is offering, or James is offering in his reading of Toussaint, is an understanding that that's where a great deal of possibility is opened up, right? Through that fragmentation. The fragmentation brings space. Into that space, people organized can step. Cool. That was a lot of questions already, so I guess I should get back to chapter 10. Toussaint seizes the power. First and foremost, we've mentioned this before, what is the power? Very interesting phrasing. Not something that we have an easy answer to, but something to hold on to as we move forward, and to hold on to it in connection to something we've already raised, which is the fact that, as we previously mentioned, James talked about his rise, and there's a gap between his rise and then his seizure of the power, right? The rise was, as we saw, the development of a close relationship between his leadership and the Black workers, the Black laboring class. And when I belabor a point as often as I do, that's a kind of foreshadowing, right? The connection between Toussaint and the masses is going to be the key question moving forward. So that first rise to that position is different from the question of his seizure of power, right? Seizure of power in the state apparatus, and in the institutions. There's a gap there. And when we approach this chapter, I asked you all to pay close attention to the way he starts it, right? When he says, Toussaint in his 12 years of politics, national, international, made only one serious mistake, the one which ended his career. What is it? He doesn't actually say, so we need to figure it out. He immediately goes on to talk about something else. It's very frustrating, right, to write this way. He says strategic necessities, he always saw early, and none of that answers the question that he has just posed. And so he is leaving it to us to figure out during the course of the entirety of the chapter. Let's see if we can figure it out. Having expelled at this point the official representative of the French government in Saint Domingo, Toussaint urgently needed and immediately needed to deal with the power of the mulatto state in the south and the west. Why? Because race tension was rising. It was being stoked by many different forces, but the French and the English in particular, and more specifically because the mulatto army was the only other force that could threaten his own power. They would, in James's words, most certainly welcome a French force and ensure the ruin of the black state. One of the very interesting developments in this chapter is going to be the way that James grapples with the personality of Rigaud, the leader of the mulatto forces, right? Because from the very beginning, he presents Rigaud as uncertain. He doesn't want to fall into this. He'd already fallen into some of the flattery. He had already begun to take and accept the compliments of the French. But when the French really begin to push hard on sort of doubling down on this division and turning it into an actual kind of military struggle, he hesitates. He threatens to resign, or asks to resign, actually. He's loyal to the French Revolution, but he doesn't want to be drawn for the sake of France into this battle with Toussaint, possibly because he thinks he cannot, possibly win it. But the French governor at that point refused to accept his resignation, and for James, this made civil war inevitable. James writes, "The French government did its diabolical work with skill." And then, as he puts it later, France kept the pot boiling merrily. Meanwhile, the British press was in a very bizarre way. This did not help things, right? The British press is taking credit for the island's independence from the French and claiming that it was actually an accomplishment of the British. It's very confusing. The British were just defeated. They were forced to leave the island, and yet there are stories being sort of fed into the British press claiming that it was not only an accomplishment of the British, but that it's an accomplishment of liberal kind of abolitionist equality, right? We've seen this before from the British. James says they didn't want to abolish the trade because they found anything to be wrong with it. They wanted to abolish the trade because it was no longer in their material interests. So these articles appearing, they're saying the black race, whom the Christian world to their infamy have been accustomed to degrade, every liberal Briton will feel proud that this country, meaning the Great Britain, brought about the happy revolution. The British, this is James now writing, after having been driven out of the island in September, were posing in December as the authors of the happy revolution and rejoicing at the freedom of a people to enslave whom they had just lost 100,000 men. He says they're lying, and they're lying to soothe, in his words, to soothe their national vanity, but they're also lying because they want to provoke this sort of division and ride it out to their benefit. So not only are the French boiling the pot merrily, so too are the British trying to stoke, division on the island by driving a wedge between Toussaint and the French governor. Toward the bottom of 227, James writes, he's very sort of sober about these things, "From no classes of people have Negroes suffered more than from the capitalists of Britain and America. They have been the most pertinacious preachers of race prejudice in the world. Yet the Americans vied with the British in its compliments to Black Toussaint and Saint Domingo trade. Part of what they want is access to an exclusive sort of negotiation for trade with Saint Domingo. And they're getting that. Toussaint is negotiating with them. He's negotiating with them because he needs trade to immediately resume so that the island doesn't starve. He tries to, you see some of the maneuvering that happens in this chapter is he's trying to negotiate directly with the Americans. Bear in mind, this is immediately after the sort of so-called American Revolution. He's trying to negotiate with them directly. It's pissing off the British. The British have a large naval fleet that threatens to blockade the island. And ultimately then he negotiates a trade agreement with the British and the Americans, and he does so under the noses of the French, who essentially tacitly approved it. They signed off on it. And they only did so, James is very clear, because they could not say no. Right? This was not something that they were in any position to enforce their opposition to. When it comes to the tension that is being stoked between the mulatto state and Toussaint, Rigaud, as James writes, defends himself from the idea that this tension is about race at all. Right? On pages 229 to 30, James reproduces a paragraph from a public proclamation from Rigaud, denying that his refusal to obey or to follow Toussaint at this point has anything to do with race. Indeed, if I had reached the stage where I would not wish to obey a black, if I had the stupid presumption to believe that I'm above such obedience, on what grounds could I claim obedience from the whites? What a grievous example would I be giving to those placed under my orders? Is it a tint of color? This is Rigaud writing, right? Is it a tint of color, more or less dark, which instills principles of philosophy or gives merit to an individual? And if one man is a little lighter in color than another, does it follow that one must obey him in everything? I'm not willing to obey a black. Why, all of my life, from my cradle, I've been obedient to blacks. Isn't my birth the same as that of General Toussaint? Isn't my mother who brought me into the world a Negro? Have I not a black elder brother for whom I've always had a profound respect, in whom I've always obeyed? At the top of 230, he writes, I have not betrayed my principles, and I shall never do so. Besides, I am too much a believer in the rights of man to think that there is one color in nature superior to another. I know a man only as a man. Now, according to James, Rigaud is not being dishonest or duplicitous here at all. And he immediately concludes, these words could not have been written before July 14th, 1789. Rigaud was, in James' words, a true son of the Revolution. He too was made by the Revolution. But honesty and reality are different things entirely. And James can see honesty here because he agrees, in part, that these were not questions of race, but questions of class, of the position and privileges held by the classes in question. And while Toussaint agreed, he also understood that the mulattoes as a class were conspiring against him. And they did so, as James repeats, as a typical intermediate class with all of the political instability of that class. In the words of one Haitian historian, Sanon, that James quotes, quote, these rivalries of color were not the initial cause of the conflict, but they complicated it and became one of its elements. And this was precisely the danger, right? That the racial component would gain an autonomy through the process of its deployment. This is actually literally what race does and how it works, right? It's a non-existent, phenomenon on a biological level that is introduced, that is created, and that then gains a level of autonomy vis-a-vis, for example, class. Which is precisely why we can't reduce questions of race to questions of class, because they don't correspond in many instances, and they don't correspond because of the autonomy that race then gains, right? Which is why we say race is a biological fiction, but a material reality with material consequences, right? This is what Sanon is identifying. This is what James is quoting him on. He continues on the top of page 231. Toussaint Louverture did not detest the mulattoes any more than Rigaud hated the blacks. And if each of them defended himself badly from the contrary sentiments, which they attributed to each other in this respect, it was because they needed, each of them, the united force of a party in a conflict where, and this is where it gets very interesting, in a conflict where the parties were confounded with the classes and the classes with the colors, right? Parties, meaning political forces, political projects, were intermingling and mixed with classes, not reducible to those classes, and those classes were intermingled with and not reducible to color, right? All three of those, not just race, class, but also politics, political orientation, political project, were confounded. Regardless of origin, however, the origin of the tension, the origin of the conflict, the war was now on. Toussaint was at war with the mulatto state in the south and could not trust any kind of alliance with them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, what's happening? Napoleon Bonaparte has, in James's description, been victorious in the internal struggle of the bourgeoisie for power. Napoleon seized power through a kind of bloodless coup on the 18th of Brumaire, 1799, overthrowing the Directory, declaring himself first consul of the French Republic. Now you may be familiar with Marx's text of the same name, the 18th Brumaire, which isn't actually about this coup in 1799. It's about a coup by Napoleon's far less capable nephew some half a century later. And it was the comparison between these two coups that leads Marx, I almost said James, that leads Marx to write his very famous phrase, the first time is tragedy, the second time is farce, right? We're not talking about the farce, we're still talking about the tragedy, namely a coup that, unlike his nephews later, is the real deal, is very much a seizure, a willful seizure of power in order to institute a new political project. Now, for many, Napoleon's coup is the end of the French Revolution, right? This is where the revolution truly ends. There had been a reaction under Thermidor. This is the actual end point of the French Revolution, since he seizes power and he faces very little resistance from the grassroots, very little resistance from the masses and the progressive forces in French society. But true to form, James had, if we remember, already declared the French Revolution dead 2 years previous to that. And that's because it was 2 years earlier that Napoleon himself, prior to seizing power, had helped to dismantle the backbone of those revolutionary organizations. In other words, the organizations that would have resisted in 1799, he had dismantled in 1797. So James is kind of, as he always does, looking below the surface for the organized framework that constitutes not a turning point, but a sort of point of inflection that predicts a turning point in the future. So there's a gap between these two pieces as well. But while Napoleon was now firmly in power and under heavy pressure from the French maritime bourgeoisie to reinstitute slavery, he was too busy for the moment on the continent to directly confront and move against Toussaint. He confirms him as commander-in-chief. He confirms him as governor. He does so, though, Toussaint notices, without writing to him personally. In other words, without treating him as someone closer to his equal. But he also passes along a very troubling note, which is to say that the colonies will no longer have representation in Paris. They will be governed according to special laws. And Toussaint is wondering, as many were, what those special laws would look like. Toussaint very quickly defeated an increasingly dispirited and desperate mulatto army under Rigaud. And at the end of 1799, Rigaud flees the island, leading James to write in a sort of reflection on the post-revolutionary kind of status quo. It's a very interesting paragraph because it just comes out of nowhere. It gets a little confusing, but he's writing about post-independence, right? He says, in the years of its history as an independent state, the mulattoes and blacks of San Domingo have fought the unceasing struggle of the classes, sometimes rising to civil war, as is common to all societies, whether homogeneous in color or not. Again, this is not specific to race, It's specific to the class fragmentation. But at the slightest threat of foreign invasion, they've always presented a solid front to the enemy. This lesson they were to learn by hard experience. This is the experience, right? Part of what's confusing about the way he's constructing is that he's telling the story of that experience, right? The failure of that unity in the face of an external threat. It's through this experience, through the decisions that Rigaud had made on behalf of mulatto forces, that this painful lesson would need to be learned. The opportunity for Toussaint and Rigaud to join forces was there. He said they both respected each other as generals and as leaders. But while the French and while Hérouville actively sabotaged that unity, sought to drive a wedge between Black and mixed race people, in the middle of 235, James writes something very interesting. He says, Hérouville's role does not concern us. The fatal error was Rigaud's. He could not see as far as Toussaint saw when he politely but firmly declined to play the fly to Maitland's spider. Again, both a question of principle and a question of strategic acuity, right? The ability to foresee the danger of the alliances being offered to you. He refused to play the fly to Maitland's spider. After defeating the mulatto state in the South, Toussaint was, as usual, very conciliatory, but he also needed to pacify the South, and the army in particular. As James describes it, this task, unfortunately, the word he uses is unfortunately, fell to Toussaint's great lieutenant, who will become very important in the coming chapters, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Despite bourgeois historians exaggerating stories of a massacre of thousands in the South after this defeat, James writes that Dessalines purged only the leadership, meaning he executed some 350 officers, still a lot. And even that led Toussaint to worry and to write to him, as he quotes, "I said to prune the tree, not uproot it." Right? But James also insists, all things considered, he had been singularly humane. Right? He did not act out of revenge. He did not act out of retribution. The goal was not to teach the South a lesson, for example, or to brutalize women and children in particular. The point was to decapitate the army of the South, right? However, this contradicted his behavior toward white emigres. This becomes very controversial, right? So the mulatto forces were seeing their leaders killed and executed. Meanwhile, the whites who had fought alongside the British were happily working on their lands, James writes. Finally, in Act 3 of this sort of two-part production, with the mulattoes defeated and with their army decapitated, Toussaint then turns his eyes to Spanish Santo Domingo in the east, which Bonaparte, and this is where the sassiness reaches extreme levels, right? Bonaparte told him, do not take Spanish Santo Domingo, in other words, what we call Dominican Republic. And Bonaparte, of course, said this because this would make him the unquestioned ruler of the entirety of the island. It would make him too powerful, and James writes, but this was exactly the reason why Toussaint was going to take it, right? Again, Rubicons are crossed, and then new Rubicons appear. Roum, the French governor, was technically in charge. He had supported Toussaint, but also tried to stoke tension with Britain, which Toussaint then avoided. And he asked Roum directly for permission to take the rest of the island. James, has these sort of very funny and interesting discussion where he says he could have just taken it, right? He was going to just take it. But then he says in the middle of 238, it's both funny but also striking. He says he had, meaning Toussaint had to the full that care of dictators to legalize their most arbitrary acts. Again, he's describing Toussaint as a dictator. I think he sees it as a description of fact, right? It's not a negatively loaded term necessarily, although it brings with it negative elements. But the point here is that no matter, whether he's going to take it or not, he wanted to seek legal sanction for it. He's trying to convince the French governor to sign, basically a permission slip for him to seize the rest of the island. He says, no, I'm not going to sign. And so they forced his hand by essentially marching on the capital, threatening to kill the whites and to sort of attack him directly if he didn't sign permission for him to invade the rest of the island. And in the end, he, of course, signs his approval, he's immediately arrested, and Toussaint seizes the rest of the island within months. Right? He was now, James writes, complete master of the whole island. And he wrote directly to Bonaparte, again, not through intermediaries, directly, asking Bonaparte to retroactively approve of the invasion that he had previously forbidden. This is where he is being openly defiant. James writes, this was defiance, and Toussaint attempted no defense. And this was more than mere defiance. It bordered perilously on impertinence. And Bonaparte was the last man in the world to be trifled with. This is quite the setup. And it brings us back to this question from the beginning of the chapter, right? Which is, what was Toussaint's one great mistake? James writes, Toussaint had burnt his boats. With vision, courage, and determination, he was laying the foundations of an independent nation, but too confident in his own powers, he was making one dreadful mistake. What are the boats he had burnt? In what way was he overconfident? He's setting you up to think that he's talking about overstepping with Napoleon. That's not what he's saying at all. He immediately says, not with Bonaparte, nor with the French government. That is not the mistake that he is making. His error was his neglect of his own people. They did not understand what he was doing or where he was going. He took no trouble to explain. It was dangerous to explain, but still more dangerous not to explain. His temperament, close and self-contained, was one that kept its own counsel. Thus, the masses thought he had taken Spanish San Domingo to stop the slave traffic and not as a safeguard against the French, but his silence confused them and did not deceive Bonaparte. He pivots very quickly, right? We think he's going to say one thing, and he says another. And if this doesn't make total sense, right, if these very confusing book-ended questions at the beginning and the end of the chapter, what was his one error? We're waiting for the conclusion. In this chapter, it doesn't really arrive, right? He answers it sort of, and it's very confusing, and it's confusing because he's not summarizing the chapter, but he's looking forward, right? He's projecting toward the way that that mistake will pan out for him. As he puts it, Dessalines explained for him. And in ways that tell us so much about the conclusion of the book and of the revolution. Dessalines explained that the war against the Spanish was just the first battle in a war that would be a war, inevitably a war against France, right? And huge spoiler alert, James writes, this was and still is the way to speak to the masses. And it is no accident that Dessalines and not Toussaint finally led the island to independence. Toussaint, shut up within himself, immersed in diplomacy, went his tortuous way, overconfident that he had only to speak and the masses would follow. So his fundamental mistake, which has not fully been explained to us, is his disregard for his own people, although we've seen symptoms of it already, right? In his demeanor, in who he's trying to please and why, in the way he's trying to reconcile different forces within this society. We'll hear more about these next week in the chapter, The Black Consul. This is a reference, of course, to the Roman Republic, itself the model for Robespierre's own understanding of Jacobinism, but it's also a reference to Napoleon himself, right? The first consul of the French Republic. But while James is sort of explicitly locating Toussaint as a black consul on the level of Napoleon, we need to always be aware, as we are with Black Jacobins itself, right, that this isn't necessarily a compliment, that there's a profound ambiguity built into locating Toussaint on the level of someone like Napoleon, in the position of power that someone like Napoleon occupies. What does it mean to be a consul? What does it mean to play a role in that vertical power structure? And more specifically, what kind of economic systems are being upheld by that position as well? Those are the questions we're going to get to a bit next week. But for now, let's take a couple more questions.
So the one big mistake is not betraying the masses, but rather than allegiance to France. But I am curious of like what the relationship with Toussaint and Napoleon is, and how like how does James view that? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as to sort of what you were sort of hinting at in the way you positioned the question of you know, losing contact with or connection with or you know, neglecting his own people is connected to the question of his loyalty to France, right? It's connected to the question that we keep raising between the word and the thing, right? Like, what kind of abstract freedom do we believe in versus what kind of freedom in reality are we trying to build? Which was a crucial question at the heart of the Haitian Revolution. So that's going to be a part of it, for sure. And it's going to bring us back full circle in some ways to this question of who Toussaint was, what his character was like, not just the sort of closed, quiet nature, but the so-called unwarped nature, right? You know, the Toussaint who did not immediately join the rebellion, right? Who waited and, you know, played a key role in organizing the army and strategically organizing the possibility of a revolution, but for whatever reason, and again, this is the tragic flaw, is not able to bring it to a conclusion, right? His relationship with Napoleon is, at this point, relatively minimal, right? They're sort of looking across at each other with mutual suspicion. He, of course, suspects that Napoleon wants to reimpose slavery, and that ultimately is the case, right? That's what he wants to do, that's what he attempts to do. It's the kind of hubris of a figure like Napoleon, who is attempting to reshape the whole world in his own image, but in a weird way, you know, Napoleon occupies this strange position of being a kind of liberal autocrat, right, in history, where he's marching across Europe, in theory, overthrowing sort of entrenched and sedimented structures of kind of feudal power and modernizing them in certain ways, but while building it as, you know, what is an empire on the most kind of like, you know, in the most kind of feudal ways. So there's a great distance. There are parallels that James is trying to draw between the way they occupy those positions of power, but also like in the same way that James is that Toussaint is a Black Jacobin, that doesn't mean he's in exactly the same position as a Jacobin like Robespierre, right? So the question is always going to be, what does it mean to be a Black Jacobin, a Jacobin and Black, right? What is that qualitative transformation of occupying both of those positions? Similar to the question that Toussaint himself raises as, you know, the desire to be free and French, right? Is that possible? And then what does it mean to be a Black consul, right? Is it to be in the same kind of position that, you know, that Napoleon himself is in? And what then explains the conflict between the two? Again, try not to say too much because it's coming. I don't want to spoil the story too much. I was watching this, this is really embarrassing, I don't know if I can say that. I was watching this new show on Netflix about James Garfield. Did people see this? Like a 4-part series on Garfield's presidency. And I won't spoil it for you, but I had forgotten how James Garfield's presidency ended. And so I'm watching this 4-part series and actually not remembering like the actual sort of conclusion of it. So it makes it more fun that way, when you forget actual historical events that you should have known. What else? I know you all got your questions out in the middle of the session, but we have time for one more if anyone has one. We good? Awesome. Next week, the Black Consul. We're really getting into the sort of concluding acts of this. Bear in mind that James is educated in European literature and drama, and the explicit ways he's going to narrate this story have everything to do with his understanding of dramatic tension and of tragedy, right? When I say tragic flaw, he's going to say the tragic flaw of Toussaint, right? And one of the questions that we should bear in mind is, to what degree is that the contour of the story that he's telling, and to what degree is it him using this European frame of tragedy to try to explain things that could be or should be explained otherwise. But we can get into that over the next couple of weeks. Do we have one more question?
Can I ask you a non-book question, but current affairs, given
Sure.
your expertise in Venezuela?
Oh no, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Any
There's a question coming about
perspective on what's going on?
Venezuela, that's it, yeah. Yeah, and I'll just repeat it. So, you know, one of our folks in the room is asking about what's going on in Venezuela. Again, to repeat it for people that didn't hear it before, this was my model for thinking through Venezuela and writing about Venezuela for very long. There's a lot to say about that, about the dynamic of how a revolution unfolds. But what I will say, and which is relevant for this context, is that I wrote a short piece in Jacobin, you know, a few years ago. We used to always joke, Jacobin's fine, it is what it is. I don't expect very much of Jacobin, but I like it for that, right? It's a very wide-reaching outlet, it has a broad audience, but the joke was always that it shouldn't be called Jacobin, it should be called Girondin, right? Because it's more of like a centrist sort of like outlet in that way, right? But I wrote this short piece on Venezuela that sort of deployed this distinction that we'll talk about next week between, but that has already come up, right? Between the Jacobins in the leadership and the sans-culottes on the grassroots level, right? What it means to be grassroots revolutionaries versus the leadership. The question, the fundamental question for James, but also for Venezuela in the course of the Bolivarian Revolution is, how do those two pieces fit together, right? I think it's essential that they do enter into some kind of relationship, right? The reality is that we're more often accustomed to situations in which there's no relation between the grassroots and power, right? This is what someone like Enrique Dussel, the great sort of late philosopher of liberation, calls a sort of fetishized system of power, where power is this separate thing that's not connected to its source, right? But there are moments in history where the source becomes reconnected with the power, and they enter into this kind of dynamic relationship, right? That happened in the early years of the Bolivarian Revolution, right? You had a moment in which Chavez, who was an incredible politician and political leader and strategist and also incredible person, none of that is super relevant, right? Like you could, you know, again, these could be value-free statements, but you'd have to recognize the fact that Chavez was someone who was capable of engaging in politics in the way that Toussaint, or even better than Toussaint in certain ways, right? He didn't have this closed-off kind of, personality. He was much more able to sort of resonate with and connect with those grassroots sectors. There needs to be a connection there, but that connection is always going to be a tense and a fraught one and an imperfect one, right? The structures of vertical power are always going to threaten the grassroots. They'll never fit. There's no, the assumption that they fit together perfectly is going to be a dangerous one. And so instead what you had at the height of the Bolivarian Revolution was a powerful dynamic where the grassroots were mobilizing in radical ways, in the same ways that James is identifying, right? Rebellious ways, intransigent ways, ways that went far beyond what Chavez and other leaders wanted, but which radicalized and drove forward a process that that sort of like revolutionized everyone, right? Chavez himself became a far more radical leader as a result of learning what the grassroots were capable of, right? And when James says the grassroots saved the revolution, that happened repeatedly in Venezuela. The grassroots started the revolution in a mass rebellion in 1989 against neoliberalism that broke open history and created the possibility of someone like Chavez then to try to overthrow the political system a few years later. But more importantly, when Chavez was overthrown in a coup in 2002, it was hundreds of thousands of people coming into the streets that brought him back to power, right? That reversed the coup. That doesn't happen, right? The reversal of coups. And it's because of this power of the grassroots. That's all to say that there was a sort of moment in which the two related very closely together in a way that was incredibly powerful. And that moment is not the same today, right? we're talking about a country that's now been in economic crisis for 13, 14 years, depending on how you kind of count it. That's coincided with a political crisis that began with the death of Chavez, and that was sort of exacerbated by attempted coups, attempted intervention, more of the same today, and also a brutal blockade, right? That's killed tens of thousands of people, if not more than 100,000. All of that has created a devastating political impact, the result of which is it's very hard to sustain a relationship between a powerful grassroots movement and the leadership of the state, right? Maduro's not the worst person in the world. He has done some things that support the grassroots and the communes, but he's also been put into a situation in which he has had to lean more heavily on the support of military generals, right? One of the very interesting things, I know this is going on a little while, but we've got a couple minutes. One of the very interesting things that emerged within the Bolivarian process and the struggles and the debates was an entire debate, one of the most interesting ones for me, not just about the communes and the decentralization of production. That's the heart of the Bolivarian process. But there was a debate within the military where this retired general in the sort of mid to late 2000s, his name was Alberto Muller Rojas, he came out and he said, listen, like, I don't think we need to have a military hierarchy anymore. Let's get rid of the generals, let's get rid of the lieutenants. Let's talk about the reality of a system in which the population as a single armed force horizontally is what maintains the revolutionary nature of this political process and defends it from foreign intervention. Today, you've got both, right? You've got both an armed grassroots militia movement, which is both official and unofficial. The unofficial is more radical. But then you've also got the military hierarchy. And it's on that hierarchy that the US is sort of like trying to lean very hard, right? They're trying to get generals to defect, so overthrow Maduro. That's what they're trying to do under Obama. That's what they're trying to do under Trump. In most countries, it would have worked already. In Venezuela, it hasn't, right? The generals did not defect. And so now they're moving on to a threat of, and what will become a reality of, real intervention. I don't think it's going to be an invasion, right? But the goal is still going to be to use, direct military strikes in an attempt to create a situation in which Maduro could be overthrown or captured, right? But the reality is, and this is the sort of punchline, that despite all of the devastation, the Venezuelan population is so much more conscious, organized, than it was before. And there's no way for the US to install a kind of puppet government under someone like Maria Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize despite not being peaceful at all, right? She is the most violent right-wing politician in Venezuela, and she somehow gets this Peace Prize. If the US tried to put her in power, there would be an immediate civil war. There's no way to sustain that, right? Because you have people who are conscious and organized, but you also have people who are armed, who hold territory in these sort of in communal power structures, and they're not going to give those up very easily. Yeah. Cool. Thank you all so much. Thanks to everyone on the stream, and we will see you next week.